especially what you just said there, when he would have arrived into Florence and seen all this. This is what a republic looks like. And
I mean, and yeah, he would have, if he stayed for any length of time, he would have absolutely seen the expression of that Republican identity because
hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. Today I am with Rachel from the Creative Contessa as we talk about a bit of Florentine fashion in Ireland. Yes, your ears are not tricking you. We're going to be talking about Florentine fashion in Ireland. Why, you say? Well, if you remember my last video from last week where I'm talking about the Gaelic resurgence, you will notice that Ireland starts to cut itself away from the English. If you haven't seen that video, I would definitely recommend that video. Regardless, the Fitzgeralds are starting to cut themselves away from the English. And one man in particular, Seamus the Usurper, the 6th Earl of Desmond, starts to make connections with his relatives, the Geraldini. Have I pronounced that correctly? Geraldini?
Gherardini.
I am so terrible at pronunciations. I'm so sorry, guys. Regardless, the Geraldini are actually related to the Fitzgeralds. And if you're like myself and other academics, you'll be scratching your head going, the Fitzgeralds? Are you sure that the Fitzgeralds are from Florence? And you might be right, actually. The Fitzgeralds, one day in 1412, rock up in the Irish Parliament with a few letters that they had been sending between themselves and the Florentines, declaring that this whole time they were not, in fact, a Norman family like we all originally thought. In fact, all of the genealogists who had connected their family all the way back to their original Scandinavian family were all wrong. In fact, the Fitzgeralds were always from Florentine, always related to this family called the Geraldini. And the Geraldini themselves had confirmed this in letters that they had sent back to Ireland around 1412. And with that, the Fitzgeralds then organize a party made up of the likes of Morris Fitzmaurice, an Irish bishop, and a few other people from Ireland. And they go off in this pilgrimage off to Florence to re-establish their connection with their old Italian family. Now, this is where we start getting into the meat of this episode when we start to talk about clothing. And this is pretty much where Rachel is going to start correcting me a whole load about clothing in the 15th century, because now I'm starting to really get out of my uncomfortable zone. And I'm pretty much open for criticism from pretty much everybody, even in the comment section. If I am getting stuff wrong, please, for the love of Jesus, correct me in the comment section. Do not allow me to walk around ignorant to 15th century clothing, because last week and for the past 2 years, as I started getting into the clothing of the late medieval period and just the history in general, I started to really fall in love with this. And so I started to look into more and more videos. And that's where I actually found your videos, Rachel. And that's where I actually got connected with yourself on Instagram. And I was like, I really need to make this video yourself about the fact that the Fitzgeralds had this family in Florentine and that they had started to make trade links with the Florentines. And we even have in the Irish Parliament laws passed through to allow the trade of wool as Florentine traders come in particular. One particular person who pops up in 1440, James of the Geraldini, who arrives to the Fitzgeralds looking for rights to be able to trade wool. So we know that trade had gone on between the Fitzgeralds and the Geraldini. So to start with, I'll basically go through what the Fitzgeralds would have worn going into the 1414s, because I myself feel like there's a lot of kind of fantasy notions of how the Fitzgeralds and the Anglo-Irish in particular would have dressed in this period. And I highlight that again, the Anglo-Irish, because in many communities within the YouTube world, um, this whole word, Anglo-Irish, is one that's up for a lot of criticism because people feel like the correct term is actually Hiberno-Norman. And
Mm.
I think that word is kind of misleading when you're dealing with the 15th century, because at that point, the Normans had kind of integrated into society. They had either gone into the English realm and started dressing very English, or they had gone into the Gaelic world, the Celtic world, as the vast majority of YouTube refers it to, and became more kind of Celtic, or as they would say in many history books, more Irish than the Irish themselves. And so they would have either dressed more like the Gaelic people going into the 14th century, or they would have dressed more just like the English in England. But then as we go into the Gaelic resurgence, we're seeing more and more of a blur going on where people are dressing a mixture of both English clothing that we see coming from Bristol, going into the likes of Dublin and Waterford and Cork, but we're also seeing clothing that's coming down from Scotland and mixing amongst the likes of the O'Donnells and the O'Neills, and then in return is coming in and mixing with the other clothing mixed in with the English. So we're saying we're slightly seeing a kind of hybrid of a mixture of clothing going in. But I think, and I'm up for a correction of Rachel here, I think the clothing that still dominates both England and Scotland in the early 15th century is still more kind of French clothing. Am I wrong, or?
No, no, you're absolutely right. And in in the French is perhaps an overly strong word. It's almost Burgundian because France at this point is this sad little kingdom that's it's basically the Ile-de-France, right? There's all these duchies and counties around them that are more powerful and wealthier. And that's why it's kind of easy for the English to come in and kick their asses on a pretty regular basis, because Burgundy is not part of France, and the Burgundian court at this point has already kind of achieved this almost legendary level of ascendancy. So yeah, if you read, I read exciting things like inventories and expense accounts from the English and Scottish royal households, and if you read those, they basically read almost exactly the same as the Burgundian and French inventories and expense accounts. Same clothing, same amount of fabrics. So there's this a lot of cultural influence from the continent in
Mm.
Scotland and England, and probably amongst the upper elite of Ireland, I would imagine as well, to imitate what's fashionable in the most powerful courts. That's kind of what everyone does.
Yeah, and it's kind of because there's so much media out right now that kind of romanticizes, in particular, the movie Braveheart, where people
Oh
are wearing
God, don't.
kilts, tartan. People kind of have this idea in early 15th century when they're fighting the English and the French and all these characters that they're dressed in a kilt and they're doing the old hokey pokey and all that kind of stuff, and their hair with their big massive claymore swords.
Of
When
course.
in fact that's not what they're wearing in the 15th century. In the 15th century, from my research, tartan doesn't re-emerge until about 1440, where you start to see little bits and bobs of tartan start to appear. And it doesn't even appear in Scotland or Ireland. It actually, the earliest one from the late medieval period, and I'm fully aware in the comments section that you do have examples of tartan before the late medieval Renaissance. But the only tartan find that starts to appear is actually in the Netherlands in 1440. Before then, there is no Scottish finds from what I have seen in both Scotland and in Ireland. And so they were not wearing tartan at this
Mhm.
period. They seem to be,
Yeah.
in my opinion, from what I've seen in both images and bog finds, is the fact that they're dressing very French, in my opinion. And
Yeah.
as you said there, that's because of the Burgundian influence that's coming in. So although there's still Irish influences because we're dealing with Anglo-Irish clothing, which Anglo being more influenced from Bristol, and as you said there, Bristol being influenced by Burgundian court. So they're dressing pretty much similar to what everyone else is
Yeah.
dressing at the period, but it still has that kind of nice Irish flair because they're still dressing for the cold winter. So
Yeah.
if people are looking for that kind of Irish imagery, it would definitely be the mantle, the brat that they would have had, this big, massive cloak that I'll be posting up. Don't worry, guys, I'll be posting that up as examples as you watch all this. But the big, massive mantle that comes on and has the shaggy what was it, the shaggy fringe at the bottom of it to keep them
Right.
nice and toasty that we can see with the likes of Richard II's records and stuff. And we can also see the likes of the Lena, which would have popped up within the noble classes and within the Gallo glass and the Kerns, the saffron Lena that would have been under the clothing to show that kind of Gaelicness, their right to the property of land and their cattle raiding ways. But the majority of their clothing would have been that mix between the Gaelic clothing and majority of it, especially within women, would have been, as you were saying there, that Burgundian influence coming into England, from England to Bristol, and then into the wider Ireland, the wider Irish world, which makes the Anglo-Irish clothing that we would see in the 15th century. So now that we've established that the Fitzgeralds at the time, when arriving, going out with their party, as we could say, of the likes of Morris Fitzmaurice and that, they would have been dressing very Anglo-Irish. So they wouldn't have been too alien when they rocked up in
Not
Florence.
right.
Tell me, in 15th century Florence, how would they have dressed in Florence at the time?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. When we started talking about this last week, and
Mm,
we talked about the journey itself, I actually I have lots of things in my research library. Amongst them are memoirs written by men who lived in the 1412s in Florence.
mm,
And the Florentines, one of the reasons is entirely likely there are these connections with Ireland, is the Florentines spread themselves out throughout Europe for business reasons, right?
mm,
For banking and for the wool trade. That is how Florence became so powerful, because it's at the crux between Venice and Rome, this perfect geographic location. So they're able to take advantage of that geography and being on the Arno River and also very near the coast. So
mm,
they can really leverage all of that and just go out and dominate Europe economically. And so there are lots of memoirs written by these businessmen who go out, and in Florence, business and politics go hand in hand. And so it's businessmen who were sent out to be emissaries to foreign courts. And so one of these gentlemen was sent to the court of France to negotiate with the King of France on behalf of Florence. And it talks about his journey, how he rode there on horseback from Florence to Paris. And it actually talks about how some of his servants were not able to keep up. They weren't fit enough to ride
mm.
horses. And so he had to leave them behind, and they had to follow on kind of at their own pace. So I could imagine that same situation happening with our Irish gentlemen
Oh
coming
no.
down, how some of them might be more adept and able to ride that long journey than others. So yeah, so when they get to Florence, what they're going to see is we're coming out of this civil war that's been going on for decades, if not 100 years, between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines.
Oh.
And Florence has also just triumphed over Pisa, one of its longtime economic rivals, and has conquered Pisa. And of course, part of conquest is looting, is the spoils of
Oh
war.
no.
And so Florence is awash in the wealth that was Pisa's. And that's one of the reasons that Pisa, to this day, if you go to Pisa, it's still kind of frozen in this like early 15th century state. That's
Mm,
because that was the last time it was it had any kind of real power and economic power. You can always tell if you go to a city when its last great economic flourishing happened, because that's the architecture that's going to greet you, right? So Florence is awash in the fabrics, in the jewels, in the artwork, in sculpture, in just all manner of assets, of very tangible assets. And so that is the Florence that these gentlemen are finding. And they've come out of this civil war. And I actually read in the memoir here, he actually talks about how wonderful it is to no longer be at war, to be able to enjoy the good life, right? La
mm.
bella vita. And so they're coming into this. So Florence is now able to devote as a comune, as a city, as a municipality, all of these resources into civic festivals and civic celebrations, right? And part of that, a big part of that, a massive part, is the clothing. Because in this era, clothing isn't just about looking sexy. It's your personal appearance. It is about the onore of your family. And onore sounds like it's synonymous with honor, but it's so much more nuanced than that. It's your reputation, it's your external appearance to the world. It is the entire history of your family line behind you. It is the future generations before you. And so all of that needs to be conveyed visually in these great civic festivals by your clothing. So what that means is, with all these riches from the recent wars in Pisa, the Florentines can really deck themselves out to the fullest extent. So I have some descriptions here of how they would dress for these great civic affairs. So I'm not certain exactly when our Irish retinue arrived. If they arrived in the middle of, say, the Feast of San Giovanni, the Feast of John the Baptist, which is Florence's biggest annual thing, they would have seen a city covered in fabric. Silk banners hanging from every single building, silk canopies over every single square, beautiful stages set up with Persian rugs covering them, platforms for musicians to just blast the city in this triumphant music, right? So if they arrived that would be June. If they arrived in June, that's what they were seeing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but there were other times of year too when the city decked itself out equally. Carnevale, so the period preceding Ash Wednesday, of course, was a very big celebration in Florence. Everyone associates that now with Venice, but that's because Venice, like 60 years ago, 50 years ago, got the idea that it would bring tourists if they started celebrating. 18th century, all Italian cities are celebrating Carnevale for the entire season. And so during Carnevale, equally, you have, the city itself is covered in fabric. It's decked out in tapestries. The people are dressed to the absolute nines. And even though the men are dressed very nicely, it's really the women who they're referred to by one historian as mannequins for the honor of the family. Like, basically, they're these giant living dolls whose sole purpose is to wear as much wealth on their bodies as their muscles and skeletons can possibly tolerate.
Wow.
Yeah, and in fact, there's one description of these women, a bride who was so ornately dressed that she had to be carried to the church porch for the ceremony because she couldn't actually support herself. She couldn't walk.
That would have been absolutely magnificent for Maurice Fitzmaurice when he arrived.
it it would
Because I don't want to put Maurice Fitzmaurice in a kind of, oh, he was a savage in the backlands of nowhere, but in a way he kind of was, because he was from Kerry, and he would have been, although he would have seen a lot of trade going in and out of what was it, Kerry and all that, to come into Europe and then go into Florence must have absolutely blown his mind to see all this. It must have been absolutely magnificent.
I would imagine, because Florence, especially the civic architecture, Florence
Mm,
at this time was like many, was a fully walled city, but it was super densely built. I mean, buildings on top of buildings, but stretching skyscrapers. They tend to think of Bologna, Germano. Everyone goes there. But Florence in this era was also a city of skyscraper-like tower homes. So literally, walking around, looking up, you would have just seen these towers stretching to the sky. We're talking 12 stories or more. Like precariously perched towers
mm,
that look like they have no structural integrity whatsoever, and yet somehow they manage to stand for centuries. Um,
mm.
this is Florence. This is medieval Florence. This is not Renaissance Florence at all. People get that very confused. They think the the Renaissance happens right after the Black Death, and suddenly there's neoclassical architecture everywhere. Not at all. Florence in this era is still medieval in almost every way, in
Mm,
its civic structures, in its politics, even in its clothing, because he's coming into what Vasari calls Gothic Florence, right? So
mm,
Giorgio Vasari is this snobby Renaissance artist and art critic of the 16th century, and he's the one who quotes the term Gothic, because he's decided that everything that came before Da Vinci and Botticelli, etc., is just, the artwork of the barbarian Goths. So he literally quotes the term Gothic. So we can owe the whole idea of Gothic architecture, Gothic art, Gothic fashion to this snobby 16th century Italian. This is a Gothic era. In what we would consider a Gothic era. We're not in Renaissance Florence yet. And so what you have are, fashion is always a reaction, an action-reaction situation. You have one fashion that's fashionable for a while, one style of clothing, and eventually someone says, no, I'm bored with that. Let's try something different. And the different thing is nearly always very different from the last thing. So in the 14th century, throughout all of Europe that I know of, which would be mostly Western Europe, you have very, very fitted clothing. You have what's called a cotardie in French, cotardie in English, cotardita in Italian, right? It's very influenced by the French court at that time. So it's very fitted in the body, sort of full in the skirts and fitted sleeves. Well, 18th century, and we're moving towards bigger is better. So you've got men and women who are wearing, against their skin, they're wearing a linen undergarment. It's called a camicia in Italian. It's called a smock in English in this era. It's called a chemise in French and a camisa in Spanish, right? So it's all kind of what we would call a shirt, but it's more than just a shirt, right? But this is the layer that you wear against your skin. It's white linen, and it can be boiled back into pure whiteness. This is the layer that takes all the abuse. Everyone wears a white linen layer, everyone. And if anyone here has worn wool clothes without a white linen layer underneath, you'll know why. And this is the layer that breathes, right? So if it gets warm, it doesn't matter. I can wear this wool dress with this linen under thing. I have worn it in Thailand in 40-degree heat with 98% humidity, and I was just fine because the linen whisks the heat away, evaporative cooling happens, and wool actually does the same thing. So it was fine, right? So you've got the linen layer, and then you've got a base layer, a foundational layer. For men, it's called a farsetto. You might call it a doublet in English. And it is an essential layer for men because their hosen are laced to this garment, right? So it's fitted to the body. And for the Italians, it's got sort of puffy sleeves down to the elbow. And we actually have one extant one. There's not many extant medieval garments, by the way. We have one extant one thus far found from the 1430s. So very close to this era, looks very much like the style you see in the pictures from this era. That was Rodolfo Malatesta III. He was a condottiero. The front half survived. The back half gave in to the body juices. So it's an essential layer. All men wore this because it's what held their hosen up. All levels of society, from field farm worker all the way up to, princes with a capital P. But this was not the final layer. This was practically underwear. The only time you actually saw this layer on men is if they were in the fields working, or if they were doing stupid man games like Civittini, which is this dumbass slap game that the youth used to play, where you would actually have three people. One person would stand on 2 feet in the middle and you just slap each other until someone passed out. It's a silly thing. Anyway, there's a depiction of it on this birth tray and in this layer. And this layer that I'm wearing now, this is the sort of later 15th century version of the base layer that women would have worn, called a gamora. And the gamora provides support for the bust, for the women's chests, and it is the house layer, I would call it. I'm now dressed for home, right? You're seeing me in my home with my French tapestries, right? So I'm dressed for home. If I were to leave my home, I would never go out dressed like this. This is how servants dress. Any kind of estate put on another layer, and so do the men. Same thing. And over top of that, the garment is called a choppa or a giornea, and the difference there is whether it has sleeves or doesn't have sleeves. And in this time, these are very voluminous garments. On the ladies, they actually come up to the neck. They have these lined, men and women, and probably it's lined in fur. The whole garment. I don't mean edges. I mean the whole garment is lined in fur. And at this point, the fur hasn't started showing yet, except for like little, sometimes around the edges. It's not fashionable to show fur in mass yet, because that's what barbarians do. And so on top of that, you then have something on your head. For the men, it's nearly always this hood that what used to be worn as an actual proper hood with a cowl, and it's been wrapped around their head in sort of variously fashionable ways. But it's still a hood. Like if you took it off their head and pulled it apart, it would be a hood with a cowl and the lyra pipe on the end. But they've just taken it and, wrapped it in different creative ways. And for the women, you're starting to get, you've got veiling and you've got nicely coiffed hair. Nearly always you can kind of see the hair tape. Instead of it going on the back of the head, it actually comes around the front of the head like a wreath, and it's taped to their scalp using fabric tape, not cellophane tape. And it's the best thing because, for women, I don't understand why hair taping ever went out. It holds forever. It feels really nice to have it done to your scalp. It doesn't pull, it doesn't break your hair. And I've actually worn this kind of thing for 2 weeks and it held up pretty well. Those 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, not on purpose. It's because I didn't have a lady in waiting to help me get it out.
No.
Yeah, so those are kind of the foundational layers. Oh, men have hosen. Ladies also have stockings that only come up to their knees and they're held on by garters. And one of the most controversial layers is the small clothes, as we call them. And these are called bray in French. They're called mudande in Italian. And the big debate in the living history community is whether women wore them. Right. Oh, you have no idea. I have a whole video on medieval women's underwear. If you want to see the biggest polemic on the internet, go watch the video and then read the comments.
Oh, Jesus.
The other thing about men hosen is that I didn't mention. In this era, they are split. So it's two separate legs. Do you ever wonder why we call them a pair of pants? It's because they used to be two separate things. You had a pair or you had one. We have inventories from this era where the men will have, and they're not called pairs, they'll say there were 13 stockings in this color, right? Because they were separate. They were completely separate, two separate legs. And so if you don't wear brays, things are going to show.
Yeah.
So, but you can see it when you see these images of the youth behaving stupidly. You can clearly see that it's two separate legs. But the reality is that having two separate legs is brilliant, especially for men at arms, because it gives you full mobility. You have no restrictions on mobility whatsoever because there's no seam in your crotch that could rip out.
And that's especially handy when you're dealing with Irish martial arts.
And then it's the other thing is that hosen were not always footed. Sometimes you have stirrup hosen where it's just there's literally a stirrup, like stirrup pants, goes around the base of the foot, like sort of the arch of your foot, but there's no foot.
Yeah.
Right. And what appears in the inventories are then socks, actually. Now they're not knit socks. This knitting is yet at this point. But their socks are listed as a separate thing from the hosen. And that makes sense. For one, as someone who wears these things for long periods and destroys them by wearing them, your feet will eat through your actual feet. The physical fleshy thing on your body, the bottom of your body, will actually eat through the sole of your hosen, the fabric sole, especially in the heel and the toes. But if you wear a sock inside the foot of the hosen, it preserves the foot of the hosen for much longer.
Yeah.
Right. So I have, and also then the hosen, the sock gets washed and can be abused to make it not smell anymore. Whereas the hosen, which are generally made out of a nicer, more expensive fabric and probably shouldn't have the hell boiled out of them, right? That doesn't need to be washed because the stinky foot has been in the sock, not the hosen foot. So so there's my theory is that people like I do modernly when I wear 15th century stuff is that people in the 15th century acknowledged that feet were nasty and wore socks inside of the feet of their hosen to preserve the hosen for longer. So and the other interesting thing about Florentine fashion that would be maybe not different, maybe very compatible with the Irish idea of footwear, is they didn't necessarily wear shoes. they actually sewed leather soles onto the bottom of their hosen, the feet of their hosen, thin leather soles. And they had overshoes that they could slip on when they went out into the streets.
Ah, now
Basically,
that's
like
fascinating.
or zoccoli in Italian, pattens in English. If you imagine kind of Birkenstocks,
Mm.
um, that you slip your foot into, and they're platformed also, not necessarily crazy platforms of the 16th century, but slightly enough to get you up out of the muck of the street.
Ah, that would have
Um,
been very fascinating. I don't know of any bog finds in Ireland like that, but I could easily imagine that suddenly appearing in the likes of Kerry and stuff around Ross Castle. That'd be absolutely amazing if they did find something like that. Obviously, finds in Ireland are quite difficult because of the way the acidic soil
yeah,
is. But God, man, I'd love to get a bog body. Hopefully, a bog body appears. It's always sad to find a bug buddy because of the background story of that. But at the
yeah.
same time, wow, they bring so many treasures to us.
You know, it's the same thing in Italy. All the extant clothes are on corpses.
Oh.
So there's a few exceptions. Saints,
Mm,
when a person dies who is sort of already being viewed as a saint, kind of in their lifetime, sort of
yeah.
the blessed, usually they're beatified at that point. When they die, their clothes get preserved as a relic, not on their
Mm,
body. And that actually happened with the Blessed Osana, who entered the convent, Andreazzi. She entered the convent in the 1460s when she was 13.
mm,
And the white wool gown that she wore when she entered the convent was preserved. She outgrew it. She was 13 when
mm,
she entered the convent. And when she died, that dress was still in her belongings. And it was not a, it was, you know, probably in the months before she entered the convent. And that dress, the skirts were cut up as relics, but and the sleeves, but the bodice and the hemline and chunks of the bottom of the skirt were actually preserved, and we actually have that. And so we actually this gamora was the construction was based on what was left of her garments. So we
mm.
do actually occasionally we're finding more and more dead person clothes from the 15th century, for similar reasons, because they were buried in them. But it's Italian Gothic, which is a very different flavor from Spanish Gothic art, from French, from English, from what they have in Ireland as well.
Mm.
It's much brighter, it's much lighter, and it's more colorful because they have different building materials. So they build things in brick or stone sometimes, but mostly in brick, and then they clad it in marble. So
Mm.
he's coming into this city where there are not as many facades as there are now, because a lot of them were actually added in the 19th century, but where many churches have these amazing white and green marble facades, right? And it almost feels to a certain extent like Rome never stopped, like Roman
Mm.
architecture never stopped, but it's not neoclassical. It's more delicate than that. It's finer, in my opinion. And so he's coming into a city like this, but he's coming into a city where the sunlight almost never touches the streets, right? Because the buildings are so tall that the streets are almost always in shade, and that the only spots where there is any kind of sunlight, any kind of daylight to really be seen are the great piazze, the town squares. And there are multiple ones. There's the various market areas, the Mercato Nuovo, the Mercato Vecchio, so the new and the old market. And then, of course, the Piazza della Signoria, which is the great open square in front of the city hall that is, you know, it's the iconic center of Florence where everyone goes and takes all their pictures. It's where the statue of David used to be, but now there's a copy of it. Yeah. So this is the Florence he's coming into. And I can only imagine that his brain would have been boggled by what he was
Oh,
seeing.
yes.
But you know, he would have seen things like that along the way. Maybe not exactly like that. It depends on where he
Mm.
stopped.
It,
You know,
it's interesting because he would have also not been too much of a bog trotter. I know people have this kind of savage idea that, he was dressed like he was in Braveheart and he wouldn't have seen anything special. Like the castle that I have behind me is Bernacchi Castle, which would be around where he would have lived. And during this period, what happens is that Richard II had introduced guns into Ireland, and suddenly all of the Irish clan chieftains and all the Irish houses, like the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers, are erecting as many castles as possible around the island. So they weren't too savagery, but at the same time, coming into Europe and then going into Florence, it still would have completely boggled his mind seeing all this, especially all the silk clothing and stuff when he was so used to seeing woolen clothing.
Right.
Yeah, definitely would have been very unique to his mind.
Yeah, so Florence especially, like, as I said, it was at the crossroads of these trade routes. It is known for its wool, but the silk production center of note is Lucca, which is another city that Florence has recently conquered.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so Lucca is kind of, it's literally between Pisa and Florence, so it was kind of a casualty of that whole affair. But Lucca is a major, and to this day, there are still a couple of silk weaving shops left in Lucca, and they're trying to rejuvenate that whole traditional trade or craft. Anyway, that means that, yeah, in Florence, there was a lot of silk floating around. And that's why, as you actually asked me originally about sumptuary laws, are increasingly present on the books. And every
Mm.
city has their own sumptuary laws because there's different issues that need to be addressed. And I've got some fun sumptuary laws we're going to delve into here, because they end up regulating, in some cases, the most ridiculous things. Like there's sumptuary laws regulating mourning clothing, and
Mm.
who is allowed to wear it
Ah.
for the deceased, and how long and what color it can be.
Mm.
And sometimes these, it's imperfect humans who write these laws, and there's always the unintended consequence of who accidentally gets banned from wearing mourning clothing because it's not specifically mentioned. Like one of the laws reads in such a way that it seems like children aren't allowed to wear mourning clothing for their parents if they die, but it's more likely that your parents are going to die. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's weird things like that. But these laws are intended to do, sumptuary comes from sumptus, which means luxury in
Mm.
Latin. And so people assume that that means clothing, but it could mean any kind of luxury item. So they don't just regulate clothing, they often do in this era, because that's where your wealth is. It's on your body, it's in fabric. We have industrially made fabrics. They're made in factories, they're made by machines mostly. And so we can purchase things at prices that Florentines would have dreamed about. I mean, so cheap, so
Mm.
cheap. But this wool, I'm wearing a wool gamora. This is actually a 1480s for those who care, because I actually haven't gotten around to making my 1410s kit yet. But anyway, this is wool. This wool, it's a medium grade wool, I would say. It's not doe skin, which almost shines like satin, which is like, now medium grade wool probably would have retailed for $200 a brachia a yard back then, even though it's just a medium grade, if not more. Silks, some of these really fine silks, and we'll put some pictures in of this,
Oh, yeah,
because I do
definitely.
have some really fine silk garments. These really fine clothes made of silk damask. That damask would have retailed for what for us would be $2,000 a yard,
Mm.
$3,000 a yard. So, and a lot of these overgarments for men and women, the really voluptuous ones, in this era would have dragged on the ground with like massive sleeves, and just so voluminous. We're talking 30 brachie, which means 30 yards times
Mm.
$2,000. So when I said you are literally wearing the wealth of your family on your body, I meant that. In fact, often these really expensive and extensive garments were so costly that even well-to-do, well-heeled merchants would pawn their silver plate and their family jewels in order to have these things made. And then and this is why we don't necessarily have that many extant garments, even of the fine stuff, after the festival was done, the Feast of San Giovanni had passed, they would then sell the garments off for materials, because the materials were more valuable than the cost of production. And so they would actually get their silverware back by
Mm.
basically exchanging them for the garments that they decided they weren't going to need again because for the next festival.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we actually have these kinds of records. So Yeah. So if we want to talk about some specifics, I don't know if you'd like me to read this a bit of this chronicle documenting a ball in Florence that welcomed the Count of Milan. He was a 15-year-old. um, he was the son of the Duke. So there's a Duke of Milan and his son, the Count, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, made a progress to Florence. And Florence knows how to play the pseudo-feudal game. Yeah, Florence is technically a republic. It's technically for the citizens, by the citizens, etc. But they still were absolutely in love with all of the trappings of what historians call pseudo-feudalism, and especially with the game of courtly love and chivalric culture. Right. People always imagine, these mercantile city-states as being peopled by gouty, bedridden merchants who need to be borne about in sedans by their poor, beleaguered servants. These men were men at arms. Every merchant in Florence could wield a sword. Every merchant in Florence had armor. Every merchant in Florence had hidden armor in their farsetti, in their doublets. They actually put chainmail so that when assassins came for them, hopefully they wouldn't die. Right. So I would like everyone to please shed the idea of the porky merchant. Those are not the people of the 15th century. In the 15th century, merchants are men at arms. They have to be, or they would all die. That's how it would go.
I would normally disagree with people that bring up any form of media, but as you described that, it does remind me of the video game, the Assassin's Creed, where you have the Medici fighting assassins and stuff. So, although they probably did not dress the way it is in the video game, it does bring that imagery to life of the Medici there fighting assassins and stuff. It's very interesting how that fits together a little bit.
Well, and the Medici, so there was a point in Florence in the 1470s where the balance of power was tottering between the Pazzi and the Medici. And it's funny how history could have completely, and I mean all of European, possibly world history, could have changed if the Pazzi's assassination attempt on Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano had been entirely successful. They actually did go after them in the Duomo, in the cathedral.
Yeah,
During mass.
That's in the video game.
they actually the Pazzi and their co-conspirators went after the Medici during mass in the Duomo. They got Giuliano. Lorenzo escaped by fleeing to the sacristy and climbing out a window with the help of his own partisans. So, I mean, if they had gotten Lorenzo, that would have been it, game over. And we would not be talking about the Medici. We would be talking about the Pazzi. And God knows how that would have changed history. So yeah, that's what I mean. Assassinations are a real danger in 15th century Italy everywhere, because this is, politics. Politics in the 15th century go hand in hand with weapons, just automatically.
And it's no shock that so much media is produced around this time, such as we were just saying there, the Assassin's Creed, but also as well, isn't the Last Duel set around this period as well?
Oh God, the Last Duel. Oh, okay. So the Last Duel, yeah. So the Last Duel is 1389. So yeah. And the Last Duel, I'm going to be doing a video on that, dissecting the clothing, because it's terrible, and the hair, oh my God, so bad on so many levels. But the thing itself, that event, that horrific event, takes place in 1389. So, that's I think that counts as like the last judicial duel to take place in France.
Yes, it does.
I think it's the last judicial duel. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the last duel in Europe, if I'm not wrong.
The term Europe is so vague, so I would hesitate to make that claim.
Even
because
right
God
now,
knows what's happening in Latvia and Lithuania.
I was gonna put that out. Yeah, we'll have to call this up.
But for certain, I'm pretty certain it's the last judicial duel in France. And that whole affair, a lot of historians want to count that as like the end of the age of chivalry, which I would never count that. I kind of think like the Battle of Pavia is kind of the end of the age of chivalry, but that's just me. I'm going to read to you about this great progress that the Count of Milan, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, made to Florence in the mid 15th century. And I want you to imagine the clothing that I'm about to describe, because sumptuous it absolutely is. Okay, so first, the setting. Sunday featured the joust, Monday, the dance, and on the following day, the hunt. Tuesday's evening featured a weapons show, but the day finally arrived for the great ball in the Mercato Nuovo, the new market. There was a raised platform, and above the area was a canopy of rich, multicolored silk. The floor was covered with Persian rugs, and all of the seats had very high backs and were regal and covered in red silk velvet. There was a location for seating the women who did not dance because of age or weight, or because they were widowed. Facing the noblemen's seating and on top of a high platform were the pipers and the trombone players. Such splendor was never seen before that day and never seen since, of course, always hyperbole. 60 youths dressed up for the dance, and 40 of them wore clothing decorated with brocade, silk brocade, shot with gold. And there were more than 50 garments decorated with silver embroidery. And when I say silver embroidery, I mean wrapped in a silver foil, right? So they would have shone in the torchlight. These costumed youths changed their clothing once, twice, or even 3 times during the day and would toss their garments to the audience as gifts and signs of the generosity of the lords who sponsored the dance. All of their leggings, all of their hosen were designed with pearls and embroidered with silver. So, you know, hosen are fitted. So hosen are kind of what people might call tights, which is definitely not what they were, but they were very fitted, and they were made out of a very specific kind of wool called perpignano. And it's not knit per se, but it's woven in such a way that it has an elasticity about it that allows it to conform to the wearer's leg. And so when you see these pictures of 15th century Italian men, or even some of the French ones in these hosen where it looks like it's painted onto their legs, that is probably not an artist's conceit. That is a kind of weave of wool that would allow that to happen. Unfortunately, finding that kind of wool in the modern world is very, very hard. So most living historians, most reenactors end up using just kind of a standard wool, which sags and bags and looks kind of sad. But that is not what they had in the 15th century. In the 15th century, they had a very special weave of wool just for hosen. So, you know, you imagine that it's fitted to their very muscular legs because, again, everyone's a warrior. Everyone rides horses. And then on top of that, tailored to the leg, you have pearls and silver embroidery. And often it's heraldic in nature, reflecting the heraldry of the lord who has sponsored either that brigade or has sponsored the festivity, or maybe even the city's heraldry, which, of course, if it's Florence, then it's the giglio, it's the fleur-de-lis. So, you know, all this silver, all this cloth of gold, it would have shone like resplendent in either sun, if the sun is shining, or in torchlight. It would have glittered. So it would have been a festival for the senses, for the visual sense as much as anything. Yeah. So yeah, that's you know, one example of sort of festival clothing, right? That's not how people dressed every day. And, you know, we have to remember that chronicles are normally not focused on the nitty gritty workaday clothing or life, because that's not interesting to anyone. No one ever thought that anyone, say me, 600 years going forward, would actually care about the details of what it was like to use a chamber pot or, right? Like no one writes about that kind of stuff. So, you know, the historical record is absolutely skewed towards the resplendent, towards the extreme end of fashion, towards the extreme end of dance, the extreme end of even deeds of arms, because, you know, if it bleeds, it reads, right?
Yeah.
That's true in the 15th century as well. And bleeding in this case could be metaphorical for shining like the sun. Right. So the interesting thing about these chronicles is they often don't talk about the women, but chronicle of this exact event that does talk about the women who attended, because this chronicler was so in love with how the youths were dressed that he mentions the women as being dance partners. but not in terms of any like actual specifics, other than that they were there and they danced and they were lovely. But there's another chronicle from this exact event, and it rarely happens that you actually get two chronicles from the exact event on the exact day, talking about it from different perspectives. So it's really fascinating when that happens. So here I can tell you about the women and how they dressed at this grand ball. So there were nearly 150 ladies, all coiffured, their hair dressed beautifully and very ornately dressed, one of gold, another of velvet, another of damask, one of silk, and so forth. In short, none wore plain cloth, of course not. And of these, there were 50 high hats in the French style. So an indication of how international Florence is, right? So your Irish retinue is coming into a Florence that is already becoming international, and that already is, you already have ladies who are dressing not even in a Florentine fashion, but in a French fashion. So that's something to keep in mind of sort of, it's not, everyone imagines that each city-state had exactly one style of clothing and no one ever dressed differently from that. But that is not true. That is not true at all. So we have these 50 high hats in the French style, all adorned with pearls and silver, with so much elegance and style that it's just difficult to express it. This poor man has denied the words to really describe it. This is in the Florentine style, were all very finely ornamented and were incredible to one who had never seen them. For example, your Irish gentleman. Like this, literally, he's telling how foreigners probably did react to seeing this scene, this exact scene, in fact. And then he says, let me say no more about the costumes, their manner, and similarly the beauty that seemed a thing heavenly divine rather than human. So that festival I talked about earlier, that was actually from the 1450s, but I do actually have a festival that took place in Florence in 1419. And it describes the clothing in real detail, like colors and length and everything, and the details of the embroidery. So this is something, this is definitely something that the Irish retinue would have seen, like 1,000,000%. Their eyes would have seen people dressed exactly like this description. Into the earlier part, or I can just read it into the record or not. It's up to you.
Oh yeah, just work away and I'll edit it. I'll go back over and edit it later.
Yep. Okay, so I'll just give a little intro onto this. The Irish retinue arrives in 1412, and we're not certain how long they stayed, but there is a man, a diarist known as Bartolomeo del Corazza, who lives in Florence. He's Florentine, and he really documents everything. We have 34 years of his diaries from 1405 to 1438. And he has an eye for detail, and he's interested in all of the happenings of the city. And in 1419, there is a feast of San Giovanni, feast of John the Baptist, and he actually documents the brigades that happened. And the brigades were these, they were groups of young men in this era who would actually come together, sponsored by some patriarch, one of the powerful families, and they would host a dance, and they would host a joust, and they would host a deed of arms, in that order. And part of the deal is that they're all supposed to be dressed the same, matching clothing of extreme luxury. And so Del Corazza, in typical patriarchal fashion, documents what the men are wearing, but not the women. But it goes into really great detail about this feast in 1419. So this is something our Irish retinue definitely would have seen. This is exactly the kind of clothing that would have met their eyes. So here we go. In the piazza, in the Mercato Nuovo, the new market, which you can visit if you want in Florence, still a market. And all 14 youths of the brigade, dressed in the same peach blossom, which reached down to just below the knee, with puffed up sleeves, the left sleeve embroidered with pearls, that being an arm that came out of a little cloud and threw flowers down the left arm. The shoes were of the same cloth, not leather, except that the left was half red and a branch of flowers of pearl was woven into it. So Yeah, just imagine that. Shoes
Mm.
made of cloth, embroidered with pearls, and that description of the arm coming out of the cloud, that's personal heraldry. So even though, Florence is a city-state, it's a republic, they're so in love with all these feudal concepts, and the emperor will actually grant arms to citizens. So any of these families that have coats of arms, they were granted by the emperor normally, sometimes the pope, I think, but normally they were
Mm.
granted by the emperor. And the emperor would actually present them with letters of patent, entitling them to bear their arms. So
Mm.
I'm not certain whose heraldry was the arm coming out of a cloud and throwing down flowers, but that was someone's personal heraldry for certain.
Mm.
So, you imagine this very full overgarment with these massive sleeves and this beautiful pearl arm, coming out of the cloud. And then you've got the flowers just flowing down the sleeve, probably covering half of it, and then matching one shoe with the heraldry on it, but also only one sleeve. The left sleeve thing is it's something that continues through the 15th century, embroidering only the left sleeve for whatever reason.
God, absolutely magnificent.
So yeah, I think that really presents a good picture of, how the kind of clothing that men would have been wearing when these Irish gentlemen
Mm.
entered the city.
Yeah, definitely.
And, I
That
feel
was
like in the modern world, we're so jaded by
mm.
all of, we can see everything in a snap of a finger. We can look it up on our devices. We can see how people dress in Japan. We can see how people dress in Ghana. We can see what Carnivale is like in Brazil, right? So we're just jaded in that we kind of have seen it all.
Mm.
But in this era, you had to go to the place to see it. And if you're lucky, maybe you read a chronicle or heard a story told about something happening in a place like Florence if you were in Ireland. But you would
Mm.
probably, as you say, probably never have seen something like it unless you had been to the place.
Yeah, because before then, this would have been the most magnificent thing Morris Fitzmaurice had seen. And now he's in the court. Is it a court in Florence or just
Yeah,
the
so it's a republic now. So I definitely wouldn't say that. I'd say that the municipal the word they use for themselves is comune.
uh,
Municipality is how it translates. So in the comune is probably what they would have. They were really desperately trying not to become a principality. And they're trying to maintain all the trappings of a good civic republic, right? And at this point, the Medici are rich and powerful. The patriarch of the Medici clan at this time actually advises his son. He says, "Son, do not dress yourself like a king
mm.
because you will invite envy and you will become a target," as Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano did, in fact, because they ignored their grandfather's advice, very sage advice, and they started dressing magnificently and they started amassing what many people started viewing as a court by the
Mm.
1460s. And so in the 1410s, you have this Medici patriarch who literally goes out dressed in plain wool and rides a donkey. And his servant, he dresses plainly also. So when he goes out through the streets, he looks like just any Joe Florentine, Giuseppe
Mm.
Florentine, right? He looks like nothing special. And that's on purpose, even though at this point, the Medici are absolutely already super wealthy. He intentionally is trying to present the image of harmlessness, of relative impotence, of being just an everyman, no threat to anyone.
It's absolutely magnificent because it's those ideas that maybe, and this is me just going out on a whims here, that when Morris Fitzmaurice is returning back to Seamus the usurper's court again, and he's talking about all these ideas, this is the point where the Gaelic resurgence has just happened. They're fighting with the English up in Dublin. They're taking the Black Rent, and you have the likes of the O'Donnells, the O'Neills. They're doing their own assemblies now. The likes of the Fitzgeralds are doing their own parliament meetings with the Butlers against the English. So I do speculate, I do wonder, did these ideas of a republic come into the Fitzgerald's court and then suddenly start having influences into their own minds. That's tantalizing stuff to think about, especially today when Ireland is literally referred to as the Republic of Ireland. Do you think those foundations started to, worm their way in? It's interesting and very exciting to think about, like, especially what you just said there, when he would have arrived into Florence and seen all this. This is what a republic looks like. And doesn't that look much more better than what we're dealing with in this kind of evil, bullish kind of dictatorship led by the English King Henry V, who's more focused on France than he is trying to fix the problems of Ireland. So what you described there is so exciting to a Irishman like himself that really enjoys his own Republican history. To have those ideas early on come in through Florence is absolutely amazing.
I mean, and yeah, he would have, if he stayed for any length of time, he would have absolutely seen the expression of that Republican identity, because, they have a council, and their leader, the leader is called the standard bearer, actually.
Mm.
So that kind of the gonfalone, so that kind of indicates the psychology that underpins that, right? You're the standard bearer. You're not our leader. You're not a doge. You're not a duke. You're not a count. You bear the honor of our city, right? It's not even the idea is not even, it's not one of power, it's one of responsibility. Right? And they actually elect every so often. It might even be once a year. And of course, the Medici end up being the standard bearer, and the other families kind of are all vying for the chance to be the gonfalone, the standard bearer. But there's also a council and so it's there's a city council and there's the standard bearer, and it's not the same people who occupy those. Those positions are elected by a limited electorate. Just like in ancient Athens, it was, the landholding men. So, but still, that's certainly much different than the hereditary feudal situation you have in Ireland,
Yeah.
right? Massively different. And so there is hypothetically some level of meritocracy involved, although that's it's slightly more, less based on lady luck than being born.
Yeah.
But even still, it does matter what family you come from and how wealthy your family is, whether you get to be. Yeah. And he would have not just seen that in Florence, and in his trek to Florence, he would have passed through Pisa and Lucca. Maybe he visited Siena. These are all city-states. These are all not principalities. So they all have their own city councils. They all have similar structures that Florence has. It's not, if he'd gone to Milano, then he would have seen a very classically feudal state run basically by a mercenary.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it would be very interesting if those ideas kind of filtered back with him to Ireland.
Also, the idea of what's very similar is the gift giving culture, but that both Florence and Ireland share, but would have expected when Maurice Fitzmaurice arrives in Florence. He would have had gifts specifically made, and he would have also had books that would have had embroidery and stuff. One of the best examples, obviously, would have been the Book of Kells, which would have been embroidered with the monks. Also, he would have had various gifts, probably gold rings, probably a gold collar. He more or less would have had these golden items to gift to the Florentines. And in return, then he, as we were saying last time, he would have gone out to get himself gifts while he's in Florentine to return back to Ireland. What kind of gifts were they expecting to give to him?
So, so Florentine gift giving customs are so complex, and because there's gift giving at the personal level or the interpersonal level, and then there's gift giving at the level of the city. And there's a whole, the complex part is the hierarchical relationships. So, whether it's a patron giving gifts to the client or the client giving gifts to the patron, and there's actually a a complex psychology of superiority and inferiority that underpins gift giving in Florence. I actually read one chronicle. It's actually mentioned in one of these diaries. These we call them diaries because that's what diaries used to be, but the modern connotation of diary makes it sound like it's all emotions and, you know, angst, but it's not. Diaries used to just be literally where people charted their daily lives, not their feelings so much, but the daily happenings, the things of moment and pitch. And in 15th century, the 15th century Italian world, that means actually purchases. That means things they've sold. That means children that have been born, children that have died. That happens a lot, by the way. And also gifts, and received and given. And so there's this really great description I found about gift giving that specifically talks about the complexity of giving gifts to someone who's higher ranking than you or superior on the social ladder, and also to being someone who receives gifts from someone who is higher on the social ladder. So this was a gentleman, and this is 1412, this particular chronicle. So this is right in our period. So this really puts us in the ethos of Florence and the idea of gift giving, and just how messy it could be if it's not done correctly. So there's this gentleman named Matze. And he was in this relationship, this client-patron relationship with a patron. And his patron, he says this is what he writes. I shall just read his words. I thought to sustain this friendship through external things rather than with internal spirit, as I should have. I often sent him small trifles. He repeatedly forbade me to do so, but I thought he only said this out of politeness. Finally, when he saw this didn't deter me, he began to send me now livery, now venison, now partridge. I became aware of my shame and of his displeasure, and I stopped, and he stopped. Thus, I am afraid this could happen to me again today. So you have this idea of this man who's obviously much lower on the socioeconomic ladder, sending matze, sending trifles that he thinks are just, you know, just to make sure he's currying, that this actually offends his patron. Because these small trifles are definitely not of the type that a patron should be receiving. He should be receiving a gift that is of his station, right? And to demonstrate that you should give what is the station of the receiver and receive of your own station, the patron shames Matze by sending him all these really expensive items that are above his station. Right. So the livery, by the way, comes from the French word livrer, to deliver, and doesn't have to be clothing. Livery is anything that a patron or a lord owes to his retainer or client as part of their relationship and is delivered to them once a year. That's why it's called livery. Anyway, he sent him livery, which probably was clothing in this case and was probably expensive clothing. He sent him venison. By the way, there aren't deer just wandering through the streets of Florence, so you have to go out and hunt them. Partridge, again, no partridge, just kind of fluttering around the streets of Florence. You have to go and hunt them. So these are all very expensive gifts. And he actually shamed Matze into stopping. Because Matze was conscientious of his place in the hierarchy of both the socioeconomic hierarchy and the hierarchy of gift giving. And so our Irish retinue, I'm going to bet they were aware. I'm confident that there's probably something similar happening in Ireland, that there's an idea of you give to the station of the receiver and you receive to your own station.
Yes, there would have been
personal gift giving, but then there's this communal gift giving. So Florence, even though it was a republic, when VIPs would come to visit Florence, Florence would put on a to-do for them, as we described in the reception for the Galeazzo Maria Sforza. And a lot of great potentates came through Florence. Its location also meant it was a waypoint on the journey pretty much anywhere north or south. Right. So every time the Holy Roman Emperor would come through, he would stop in Florence because it was a very convenient way stop on the way to or from Rome. And there's the Frederick, and of course with his retinue, He comes with probably 60 or 70 people in tow. And so of course they quarter them, they put them up in the finest quarters, they basically lodge them in the private palazzi of the great families of Florence. And this one dates to, it is in the 1410s when this one happens. And the city's idea of a gift for VIPs is literally to lay a table with silver platters. I mean, silverware in the old meaning of that term. So platters and goblets and bowls and salt cellars and amazing, these works of art, basically in silver, to load them with food, the richest foodstuffs, the most exotic foodstuffs, spices, just to lay this amazing table. And that whole table was the gift.
Mm.
All of the platters, all of the foodstuffs were to be not necessarily eaten all there. They were to be taken back and distributed amongst the retinue. And so you imagine that and here's the interesting thing. So a chronicler writes about this, about the presentation to Frederick. He says that the emperor was almost stupefied at the number of delicacies, the quantity of poultry, the enormous amount of food caught at the hunt, the great mass of meat, the number of both white and red wines, the abundance of grain. It was such as to not appear provision for just a group of people, but for the most imperial of princes, or for a populous region. Right? And so the emperor took this back and then distributed the food was probably eaten pretty quickly by his retinue. It's not going to last very long. But the silverware was distributed amongst his people. And that was common. That was very common, that these gifts would be taken by whoever was the VIP and then sort of filtered down through the ranks to their own people. But what's really interesting about the gift-giving culture in Florence is that it was apparently common to regift.
Oh.
Regifting, yeah, regifting was a common practice. And even though it was sort of socially marginal in terms of its acceptability, everyone did it. It was common. And you would either regift or sell the gift to get the money for the gift. Because there's this idea that money is ironic for a city that's a merchant city, but giving someone money that's a dirty business transaction. That's not a gift. So you give someone something that's really expensive and then they sell it. Well, that's fine. So it was almost a way of giving money without giving money. And there's this whole weird regifting culture throughout all of Europe, actually. This web of regifting culture from, at all levels of society, where you receive a gift and you're like, oh, thank you. You shouldn't have. I'll just save that to regift for later. And this culture of selling gifts for money, and it wasn't offensive to do that. Now, God forbid, in America anyway, you get a present and someone catches you, regifting it, they will be super duper offended.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about this gifting culture and this regifting culture is that's how you end up with some of the most bizarre exotic items in museums to this day. Right. We just assume that if something's in the British Museum, it's there because they went and took it, but that's not always true.
Yeah.
Actually, often a lot of the more exotic items, for instance, in the Leeds Armory, there's a suit of 16th century samurai armor. And everyone's going to assume if they see it that some Brit went and took it, but that's not true. It was actually sent with the first Japanese entourage, embassy to come to Europe. Crown, right? So that's how it ended up to Spain. Sorry, not the British, the Spanish crown, right? So that's how it ended up in Europe. And it ended up in Spain because it went up for sale when Spain was bankrupt and they needed money. And right, it got bought in the 19th century. But still, that's why a lot of these weird exotic things end up in modern museums, because they were gifts.
Niall O'Neill, going into the Williamite Jacobite Rising Wars he in 1690, going into the Battle of the Boyne, has a painting done, and he has samurai armor in the painting. So you have everyone else in traditional, because he's leading the Jacobites. So you have everyone else in their traditional Scottish wear that everybody can relate to with the Jacobites and stuff. And he's dressed in samurai armor. And we know of the samurai armor because of the painting. So yeah, we have the strangest things going on. And because of this, we now have an image of everyone else being very traditional in this kind of battle, the classic Battle of the Boyne. And here's Niall O'Neill leading the Jacobites in their kilts, what was it, their great kilts and their guns and stuff, and their nice bonny hats. And here's him dressed in samurai armor. So I fully agree. Sometimes the gifts that are sent around the place can be absolutely mental. So yeah, that's absolutely fascinating that we see the same thing going on in Ireland as well. So exciting. Thank you so much, Rachel, for talking to me. When I started my project on the Gaelic resurgence back 2 years ago, I never expected to come across documentation that talked about a connection with Ireland and Florence. And even finding your channel and even having a conversation with you today is so exciting to bring Ireland into the bigger fold that is continental European history, especially in such an exciting era that is the Renaissance. For me, is absolutely exciting. You know, ever since I was a small child, having this imagery of the medieval world. But the difference being is when I was small and tiny, I had seen Ireland and Scotland from the viewpoint of Braveheart, where they're wearing kilts and tartan. And now that I've become older and started getting myself more into medieval history, to broaden and open up my horizon, and having a conversation with you today means absolutely so much for me, but also educates me to the wider world of what actual medieval history was like. And I hope the viewers today who are watching this, at the end of this, have a much more open and enlightened mind to what actual medieval history was like. Rachel, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. It means so much to me, and I hopefully for the viewers today that have watched this, they themselves would be like, wow, like Ireland really was a part of a much more bigger picture. And I think that's what it's all about, is really, you know, having these deep conversations. Rachel, you're an absolute cyclopedia when it comes down to this kind of information, and I'm so happy that you agreed to come onto my channel today. Next week, I hopefully will be able to have a nice Q&A over on your channel, and we'll be able to satisfy any questions that were brought up this week to do with my video, and also the previous video as well with the Gaelic resurgence, and also the broader world of what's happening in the continent. And although we're not the biggest and greatest masters, hopefully we're able to answer whatever questions appear. Once again, Rachel, thank you so much. If you're looking to subscribe to Rachel, please do so. All of her information will be popping up on screen now. And as always, guys, thanks very much. Slán go bhfuil.